The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon in November 1974. Harold Bernstein was sitting at his desk at the Los Angeles Times, staring at 43 years of journalism awards on his wall and wondering what any of them meant. He was 67 years old. His wife had passed 2 years earlier. His children had moved away and built their own lives. And in 3 months he would retire from the only career he'd ever known. He picked up the receiver on the 4th ring. Bernstein. Harold, it's Jim from Entertainment. I've got a favor to ask. I'm listening. Dean Martin's publicist just called. He's doing one last round of interviews before his TV show wraps its final season. They want a serious piece, not the usual fluff. Something substantial for the legacy. Harold laughed bitterly. Dean Martin doesn't do substantial. He does charm. He does jokes. He does everything except tell the truth. That's why they want you. You're the best in the business. If anyone can get the real Dean Martin on paper, it's you. I've interviewed him 3 times over the years, Jim. Each time I got the same rehearsed stories, the same fake drunk routine, the same wall of charm. The man is impenetrable. So crack him. One last time. Consider it your swan song. Harold was quiet for a moment, looking at those awards on his wall. 43 years of asking questions. 43 years of searching for truth in a city built on lies. What was one more attempt? Fine, he said. Set it up. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Dean's home in Beverly Hills. Harold arrived at 2 p.m. as agreed, carrying a tape recorder and a notebook filled with questions he knew would never be answered honestly. A housekeeper led him through the massive house to a study lined with gold records and movie posters. Dean was waiting there, dressed casually in a golf shirt and slacks, looking exactly like the image he'd cultivated for decades, relaxed, effortless, slightly amused by everything. Harold Bernstein, Dean said, extending his hand. The legend himself. I've read your work for years. You're the only journalist in this town who makes people sound like actual human beings. And you're the only entertainer who makes being human look like a magic trick, Harold replied. Dean laughed. I like you already. Drink? No, thank you. I'd like to keep my head clear. Suit yourself. Dean poured himself something amber from a crystal decanter. Harold noticed that he barely sipped it throughout the entire conversation. Interesting. They settled into leather chairs across from each other. Harold clicked on his tape recorder. So, Harold began. The standard questions first. The TV show is ending. How do you feel about that? Great. Wonderful. It's been a hell of a run, and I'm grateful for every minute. And what's next? Golf, relaxation, maybe a movie here and there if the right project comes along. But mostly I'm looking forward to slowing down. The answers were smooth, practiced, completely empty. Harold had heard variations of these responses from 100 celebrities over the years. They meant nothing. He tried different angles. Dean's childhood in Steubenville, his early days in show business, the partnership with Jerry Lewis, the Rat Pack years. Each question received a polished, charming, utterly hollow answer. After an hour, Harold set down his pen. We're wasting each other's time, he said. Dean raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? This interview, these answers. You're giving me the same performance you've given every journalist for 30 years. The same stories, the same jokes, the same carefully constructed version of Dean Martin that doesn't actually exist. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Harold leaned forward. I've been doing this job for 43 years, Mr. Martin. I've interviewed presidents, murderers, saints, and con men. I know when someone is lying to me. And you've been lying since I walked through the door. Dean's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. That's quite an accusation. It's not an accusation. It's an observation. You're a performer. You've been performing your whole life, and right now, you're performing for an audience of 1. Harold gestured at the tape recorder. But here's the thing. I don't care about the performance. I'm retiring in 3 months. This is probably the last major interview I'll ever do. And I'd like, just once, to write something true about Dean Martin instead of another puff piece about the King of Cool. The silence stretched between them. Dean stared at Harold with an intensity that contradicted his reputation for lazy indifference. "Why should I trust you?" Dean asked quietly. "You shouldn't. I'm a journalist. My job is to expose things. But I'm also a dying breed, a man who still believes that truth has value, even in a city that runs on lies." Harold paused. "I'm not asking you to tell me anything that would hurt you. I'm asking you to tell me something real, something that matters, something that explains who Dean Martin actually is, underneath all the smoke and mirrors." Dean was quiet for a long moment. He swirled the drink in his glass, the drink he still hadn't actually consumed, and stared out the window at his perfectly manicured lawn. "You want to know who Dean Martin actually is?" he repeated. "Yes." "And what makes you think I know the answer to that question?" Harold blinked. It wasn't the response he'd expected. "I've been performing so long that I've forgotten what's real," Dean continued. "The drunk act, the cool persona, the nothing bothers me attitude, I started doing it as protection, a way to keep people at a distance. But somewhere along the way, the protection became the prison. Now I can't take off the mask because I'm not sure there's anything underneath." Harold sat very still. This was different. This was real. "When did it start?" he asked softly. "The mask?" Dean was quiet for a moment, lost in memories he rarely visited. "Steubenville. I was maybe 7 or 8. Kids at school found out my family was Italian. Really Italian. Not the kind of Italian that gets you invited to parties. My father barely spoke English. We lived in the Italian section of town, which meant the poor section. The kids called me names: Dago, Wop, Guinea. They'd push me around, tell me to go back where I came from. What did you do? I learned to make them laugh. If I could make them laugh, they'd stop hitting me. So I became the funny kid, the entertaining kid, the kid who never took anything seriously, never showed that the words hurt, never let anyone see the fear." Dean took a breath. And it worked. The kids stopped beating me up. They even started to like me. But the price was, I had to keep performing, every day, every interaction. I couldn't let the mask slip, not even for a second, because if they saw the real me, the scared kid who just wanted to be accepted, they'd go right back to hurting him. Harold was writing furiously, his tape recorder spinning, capturing something that Dean Martin had never shared with any journalist. "The mask got more sophisticated as I got older," Dean continued. "In show business, it became the Dean Martin persona, the drunk, the womanizer, the guy who doesn't care about anything. People loved it. They wanted to believe that someone could float through life without any of the pain and struggle that they felt. I gave them that fantasy. But it was a fantasy. Completely. I don't drink. Not really. A sip here and there to maintain the illusion. But I've never been drunk on stage in my life. The glass is always filled with apple juice or ginger ale. The stumbling, the slurred speech. It's all acting. Always has been." Harold stopped writing. "You've maintained that illusion for 30 years. Why?" "Because it works. People expect Dean Martin to be a certain way. If I showed up sober and serious, talking about my feelings, they'd be disappointed. They didn't pay to see Dino Crocetti, the scared kid from Ohio. They paid to see Dean Martin, the King of Cool. So that's what I give them." "And what about the people in your life? Your family, your friends? Do they see the real you?" Dean's face clouded. "My wives tried to. That's probably why the marriages failed. They'd get close to something real, and I'd push them away. It's easier to be alone than to let someone see the scared kid." "Your children?" "I love my kids, more than anything. But I've kept them at a distance too. It's the only way I know how to be. The mask doesn't come off. Not for anyone." "That sounds incredibly lonely." Dean smiled. A sad, tired smile that had nothing to do with the famous charm. "It's the loneliest thing in the world. I'm surrounded by people who love Dean Martin. But Dean Martin doesn't exist. He's a character I invented 50 years ago to protect myself. and now I'm trapped inside him." Harold was quiet, absorbing the weight of what he was hearing. This wasn't just a celebrity interview anymore. This was a confession. "Why are you telling me this?" Harold asked. "After 30 years of keeping this secret, why now? Why me?" Dean considered the question. "Because you asked. Not for the story I always tell, but for the truth. And because—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Because I'm tired. I've been performing for 50 years. I've maintained this illusion through 3 marriages, 7 kids, 100 movies, 1,000 television shows. And I'm exhausted. So let it go. Drop the mask. Let people see the real you. It's too late for that. The mask is the brand. The mask is what people pay for. If Dean Martin suddenly became a serious, emotional, vulnerable human being, the whole thing would collapse. The mystique would die." "Would that be so bad?" Dean laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. Without the mystique, there is no Dean Martin. There's just Dino Crocetti, a 60-year-old man who spent his whole life pretending to be someone else. Who would want that? Your children might, your real friends, the people who've always suspected there was something more beneath the surface. Maybe, but I've been hiding so long I'm not sure I could stop even if I wanted to. The performance is automatic now. It happens without thinking. Someone walks in the room and Dean Martin appears. Dino Crocetti stays hidden." They talked for another 3 hours. Dean spoke about things he'd never discussed publicly: the terror of his early career, the guilt of his failed marriages, the fear that his children would never know who he really was. He talked about the death of friends, the loneliness of fame, the strange prison of being beloved by millions who didn't actually know you. He talked about his son Dino Jr., the pride he felt watching him become a pilot, the fear he carried every time the boy flew, the conversations they'd never had because the mask wouldn't allow for that kind of vulnerability. "He's the best thing I ever did," Dean said quietly. "Better than any movie, any song, any performance. And I've never told him that. Not really. Not in a way that matters." "Why not?" "Because Dean Martin doesn't say things like that. Dean Martin makes jokes, keeps it light, never lets anyone see how much he cares. But you could change that. You could call him tonight. Tell him what you just told me." Dean was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe I will. Probably I won't. The mask is heavy, Harold. You don't just take it off because someone suggests you should." As the sun set over Beverly Hills, Harold finally turned off his tape recorder. He had enough material for a dozen articles, the most honest interview Dean Martin had ever given. The definitive profile of a man who had spent his life hiding in plain sight. "What are you going to do with all this?" Dean asked. "Write it. That's my job." "And then publish it for the world to see?" Harold hesitated. He thought about what this story would mean. The headlines, the reactions, the dismantling of a carefully constructed legend. People would debate whether it was true. They would analyze Dean's every public appearance, looking for cracks in the mask. The mystique that Dean had spent 50 years building would evaporate overnight. "I don't know," Harold admitted. "I have to think about it." Dean nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Harold. Most journalists would have published this before the ink was dry. They wouldn't care what it did to me. I'm not most journalists. I'm also not your friend. I have an obligation to the truth. But I've been doing this job long enough to know that some truths do more harm than good. So what decides it, whether you publish or not?" Harold stood up, gathering his notes and tape recorder. "I'll know when I'm done writing. Sometimes the act of putting words on paper clarifies things, shows you what matters and what doesn't." They shook hands at the door. It was a strange moment. 2 men who had spent their lives in different kinds of performance, meeting briefly in a space of unexpected honesty. "Thank you," Dean said, "for listening, for asking the right questions. I've never told anyone those things before. Thank you for trusting me. I didn't trust you. I just ran out of energy to lie." Dean smiled that famous smile. But this time, Harold could see the sadness underneath. "That's what happens when you get old, Harold. The performance gets harder to maintain, the mask gets heavier, and sometimes you just need to put it down, even if only for an afternoon. Harold drove home in silence, his mind churning with everything he'd heard. When he got to his apartment, he sat down at his typewriter and began to write. He wrote for 3 days straight. Every word that Dean had spoken, captured on tape and transcribed with meticulous care. Every revelation, every confession, every moment of unexpected vulnerability. He shaped it into an article that was unlike anything he'd ever written, a portrait of a man who had hidden in plain sight for 50 years. When he finished, he read it back. It was, without question, the best piece of journalism he'd ever produced. It was also, without question, a betrayal of everything Dean Martin had built. Harold sat with the article for a week. He read it again and again, wrestling with the decision. The journalist in him said, "Publish. This was truth. This was important. This was what readers deserved to know." The human being in him said, "Burn it." This was a confession given in a moment of exhaustion, and publishing it would destroy a man who had trusted him. In the end, the human being won. Harold put the article in a manila folder, labeled it Dean Martin Unpublished, and filed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He called his editor and said the interview hadn't worked out. Dean had given him the same rehearsed answers as always. He never told anyone what really happened that afternoon in Beverly Hills. Harold Bernstein died in 1989, 14 years after the interview. His daughter, Rachel, was tasked with going through his belongings, a lifetime of journalism condensed into filing cabinets and boxes. In the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a manila folder labeled Dean Martin, Unpublished. Inside were 47 typed pages and 6 audio cassettes. Rachel read the first page, then the second, then stayed up all night reading the entire thing. By dawn, she was in tears. This wasn't journalism. This was revelation. A window into the soul of a man the whole world thought they knew, but no one actually understood. She thought about what to do with it. The responsible thing was to publish. Historical record, public interest, all the justifications journalists use when they expose secrets. But her father had chosen not to publish. There must have been a reason. She found the reason in a note tucked into the back of the folder, written in her father's cramped handwriting. "I wrote the best article of my career today. I'm not going to publish it. Some truths are too private to share, even when they're important. Dean Martin trusted me with something he'd never given anyone else, his real self. If I publish this, I become just another person who took from him. If I keep it private, I become something rarer, a person who gave him something in return. Silence, protection, the knowledge that his secret was safe with someone. Maybe someday, after we're both gone, this will matter. Maybe someone will want to know who Dean Martin really was, underneath all the performances. If that day comes, this article will be here. But it won't come from me. My gift to Dean is keeping his secret while we're both alive to care about it. That's what trust means. Not just receiving it, honoring it." Rachel read the note 3 times. Then she put everything back in the folder and returned it to its place in the bottom drawer. Dean Martin had died in 1995. Her father had kept the secret for 21 years, through Dean's final television appearances, through the death of his son, through his long retreat into solitude. He'd never told anyone. He'd never even hinted. That was honor. That was integrity. That was the kind of journalism, the kind of humanity, that didn't exist anymore. Rachel decided to follow her father's example. She kept the folder. She didn't publish. She honored the trust that Dean Martin had placed in Harold Bernstein on a Tuesday afternoon in 1974. Years later, when Rachel herself was old and sorting through her own affairs, she thought about what to do with the folder. By then, everyone involved was dead. Dean, her father, most of the people mentioned in the interview. The historical argument for publication was stronger than ever. But she kept hearing her father's words. Some truths are too private to share, even when they're important. In the end, she donated the folder to a university archive with a 50-year seal. It would be opened in 2039, long after anyone who remembered Dean Martin personally was gone. Long after the revelation could hurt anyone. The note she attached was simple. My father believed that some secrets are worth keeping. He also believed that truth eventually finds its way into the world. This is his compromise. Protection for the living. Revelation for history. Dean Martin spent his life hiding behind a mask. My father was one of the few people who ever saw what was underneath. He chose to protect that vulnerability rather than exploit it. I hope whoever reads this in 2039 understands what that choice meant. In a world that rewards exposure, my father chose discretion. In a profession built on revelation, he chose silence. That's not weakness. That's not cowardice. That's love. And it's the truest thing my father ever did. Somewhere in a university basement, a manila folder waits. 47 pages. 6 cassettes. The voice of a man who spent his life hiding, speaking openly for the first and last time. The truth about Dean Martin. Waiting for a world that might finally be ready to hear it.